Good evening, everyone. My name is Yanelis Padron, and today our group will speak about our replication projects. Before we begin, we are going to start off by talking a little bit about ourselves. My name is Yanelis Padron, as I said before. I am 24 years old, and this is my third semester at Ball State. I drink a lot of coffee, which was you guys will see why I'm mentioning this now. But for now, I'll introduce my other group member, Brandy.
I'm Brandy Gordon. I'm in my third semester here at Ball State, and I live in Michigan. I love drinking frappes from Starbucks.
I'm Melissa Schwartzbaum. I'm also in my third semester at Ball State. I'm from Miami, Florida, and I drink a lot of coffee. I mixture between iced and hot, depending on how hot it actually is down here. But I enjoy it either way, so you guys will get to see that too.
Hi, I'm Allison McRae. I live in Michigan too. I'm 23 years old, and this is my second semester at Ball State. I usually just drink hot coffee.
My name is Brittany Anderson. This is my first semester at Ball State. I live in a small town in Indiana, and I drink lots of iced tea.
All right, so now that everyone has given their introduction, I am going to start off by speaking a little bit about the original study. The original study focused on a 50-year-old female who had a history of consuming 350 milligrams of caffeine a day for 35 years. In order to conduct the study, she focused on reducing her intake of caffeine. She began by recording her daily intake of caffeine in a behavior diary, where she would record who she was with and how much she was drinking. And she also used a performance scale where she would rate the consequences of reducing her caffeine intake. Her intervention was a changing criteria design, and it focused on reducing the levels of caffeine in phases for 10 weeks. So for the first stage, she decreased her caffeine consumption to 160 milligrams. On the second phase, she consumed 35 milligrams per day, and then her goal was to reach 35. Results of her study revealed that on stage 2, her symptoms of withdrawal were higher, so she was tired more frequently in stage 2 than stage 1. And then in stage 3, her results were similar to baseline, showing that her intervention was effective since she wasn't experiencing a lot of withdrawal symptoms. Our project sought to replicate this experiment. We started off by each of us completed a pre-interview form where we answered questions about how caffeine made us feel. Once that was completed, each participant began recording their own baseline data on June 5th. Baseline data was recorded until it was stable enough, and once baseline data was stable, each participant began their intervention. The intervention focused on reducing caffeine consumption gradually until reaching 0 milligrams. And we also used a behavior diary where we would record our daily intake of caffeine as well as the consequences of reducing caffeine consumption. So now I'm going to share with you all my data. Okay, so as you can see here, my baseline data was usually 80 milligrams per day, and I started my baseline data on June 5th until June 10th. I sought to decrease my consumption of caffeine to 60 milligrams in phase 1, to 30 milligrams on phase 2, and finally to reach 0 on phase 3. The criteria line on my graph shows that I was able to master my designated amount before moving on to the following phases. During the intervention period, I experienced headaches 44% of the time, experienced yawning 22% of the time, and I experienced tiredness 66% of the time. I also experienced watery eyes 11% of the time. There was not one point in this intervention where I felt okay or good. And now Allison will present her data.
Okay. So during my baseline data collection, I was drinking 60 milligrams of Maxwell House light coffee. This consumption began this past year after I started working at an ABA clinic. Coffee was provided in multiple places for employees. Since I started working here, I never thought about stopping this consumption because I was beginning to become very dependent on it. My intervention phases had varied, as you can see. 7 out of the 9 days I'd experienced headaches resulting in 77% of the time. 2 out of the 9 days I exhibited tiredness feeling, and 1 out of the 9 days I didn't have any effect on my body. During my first criterion, I did indulge in 40 milligrams of coffee due to not being able to handle how my headaches were feeling. In my second criterion, I as well had 20 milligrams of coffee. Some of the consequences that I had during the intervention resulted in being tired and having headaches. During the intervention, it took place between June 13th and June 21st. In the original study, those participants too felt tiredness and headaches like myself. Knowing that I wasn't alone with these side effects helped and assisted me in continuing the intervention process. After the second criterion phase, I didn't consume any more coffee. My headaches did get worse, but I didn't think it was unbearable as it had been before. After participating in the study, I realized that my body can live without caffeine, and even though it was very difficult in the beginning of the intervention, after the first 5 days, I felt much more confident that I could finish the intervention strong. Since the intervention has ended, I have stuck to the intervention, only drinking coffee every once in a while now. I feel better when I don't drink it and only consume small amounts. This has helped myself not be so dependent on it. Drinking hot tea has become my new thing as well. My craving for that hot taste has gone away, but it is a much healthier substitute.
Alrighty, as shown on the graph, I consumed an average of 90 milligrams of caffeine throughout the baseline phase. This phase lasted from June 15th from June 5th to June 11th. During phase 1, I consumed an average of 30 milligrams of caffeine, and by phase 2, my consumption decreased to 15 milligrams. Surprisingly, by phase 3, which was from June 18th to June 20th, I was down to 0 milligrams of caffeine each day. During baseline, I noticed that I consumed coffee because I was either sleepy, tired, or simply craving the taste. After the consumption of caffeine, I felt energized, more productive, and a sense of satisfaction. Similar to the original study conducted, I experienced headaches and tiredness. In addition to, I found myself to be very irritable without my daily cup of coffee. Throughout the intervention phase, I experienced headaches 4 out of the 9 days, which is 44%. I experienced feelings of tiredness 22% of the time, and irritability 3 out of the 9 days, which results in 33% of the time. Throughout this time, I substituted my cravings with water, which helps by quenching my thirst, and sometimes removing the craving. Since the study has ended, I have resumed consuming caffeine, but in slightly smaller doses. If I find myself craving more coffee throughout the day, I'll have a cup of decaffeinated coffee or tea. Coming from a family of avid coffee drinkers, I never thought about the long-term effects or the addictive properties of caffeine consumption. Moving forward, I will attempt to consume more decaffeinated drinks instead of those with caffeine.
Although our study was shortened replication of the study performed by Morfitt and colleagues, the results happened to look very similar. During baseline, I drank an average of 115 milligrams of Starbucks Pike Place. This drink is my personal preference for my daily caffeine intake, and has been for about 3 years. I have experimented removing this drink from my diet. In the original study, the average baseline caffeine consumption was 353 milligrams. The participant in this study also stated to have preferred coffee over tea and soda. Throughout my intervention phases, I experienced headaches 4 out of 9 days, or 44% of the time. The participant in the original study experienced more headaches than usual in 4 out of the 9 weeks of intervention. This is a clear indication that caffeine truly can affect our physical health. A withdrawal can easily cause discomfort no matter what the substance is ingested. During my first and second criterion phases, I wound up drinking 60 milligrams of coffee on one of the 3 days of criterion. I felt like I could not get any work accomplished between the grogginess and headaches I endured. For those 2 out of 9 days of intervention, I indulged in a smaller portion of caffeine than what I was accustomed to during baseline. In the last criterion phase, I was able to eliminate caffeine for 3 days in a row. I was surprised that I was able to last 3 days, but I continued to feel the consequences. Tiredness and cravings for coffee also occurred for myself and the participant in the Morfitt et al. Study throughout the intervention phases. I reported being excessively tired 6 out of the 9 days of intervention, a 66% average. At this stage of intervention, I knew that decreasing caffeine intake not only has a physical effect, but a mental one as well. Craving the coffee was my body's way of telling me that it wanted what I was depriving it of. Overall, the reduction of caffeine affects our daily lives. As stated in the article, A Case Investigating a Behavioral Intervention to Reduce Caffeine Consumption, having done only an A/B design is a limitation to the study. Going back to baseline before another intervention phase would certainly give more data on how our bodies react to caffeine intake. Based on the data I collected on myself throughout this 17-day study, I do not think I will be reducing caffeine in my diet in the future. The negative effects, such as having headaches, being tired, and craving the coffee, were too strong for me to ignore. However, I have gained insight on my personal experience of consuming caffeine. I rely on it more than I expected to. I do believe that too much of it can be harmful to your body, as it is not a natural way for you to gain energy. I will continue my daily routine of eating healthy, exercising, and drinking a cup of coffee in the mornings to feel energized.
Hi. For my study or replication, I drank unsweet iced tea, about 62 milligrams during the baseline phase. I'll pull up my graph. There was one day during the baseline phase that I had forgotten my cup of iced tea on my way to work. Before this project, I would drink probably a couple caffeinated beverages a few times a day. My average caffeine consumption for baseline phase was 55.71 milligrams. During the criterion 1, during the intervention phase, I was down to 39.33 milligrams per day. And during criterion 2, I was able to reduce my caffeine intake to 20.67 milligrams with very little negative consequences. However, in the criterion 3, where I reduced to 0 milligrams, I experienced some negative consequences such as headache or fatigue. And on the side, I have my data table. Next, I have a pie graph of antecedents to caffeine consumption for myself that I've taken from my diary log. 90.91% of an antecedent to caffeine consumption was a transition. Most of my transitions were to work or to the gym. And then 9% of antecedents to caffeine consumption was working on homework assignments, and those usually occurred on the weekend. My next graph shows consequences experienced after caffeine consumption. It was either energized, focused, jittery, tired, or no effect felt. The majority, 63.64%, I felt energized and focused after caffeine consumption. One day I felt no effect. 2 days I felt tired even after caffeine consumption. And then one day I felt jittery, and on that particular day I drank a 0-calorie sugar-free energy drink. As for antecedents to non-caffeine consumption, 80% was thirsty, and that was usually in the morning after waking up, and 20% of the time was a transition. Again, to work or the gym. Consequences felt after non-caffeine consumption. Half of the time, or 40%, was hydrated, 20% headache, and then 20% no effect. And then in conclusion to our project, there are several differences from our study compared to the original study, one being the age difference. The original participant was 51 years in age and had been consuming caffeine for 35 years. Our average age in this project is 24, so we've probably been drinking caffeine for about 10 years, so that's a big difference. And the other big difference is the duration of our project. The original study was 10 weeks, while ours was roughly 3 weeks, more like 2.5. And our average caffeine consumption throughout the whole project was 46 milligrams, and the participant was 355 milligrams during the baseline phase. That's a huge difference in between the amount of caffeine consumed per day from the original to the replication project. Another difference is the amount of caffeine reduced per each day for participants. The original study's goal was to reach about 35 milligrams to 50 milligrams of caffeine consumed by the end, while ours was 0. And there were several similarities in our project compared to the original, one being the withdrawal symptoms such as headache, fatigue, drowsiness, and lack of focus. And in the original study, week 3, or criterion 3, was the day, or criterion 2, was the day or the week that more withdrawal symptoms were felt, such as headache. Our replacement beverages were also very similar. We decided to stick to water, decaffeinated tea, and decaffeinated caffeine. She used herbal tea, which is something that a couple of the participants had during the intervention phase. Another similarity was the diary logs and interview questions that we did on ourselves. As for limitations mentioned in the original study, they used an AB design, which is the simplest form, and an AB design would have been more beneficial to show more conclusive data. However, when you're dealing with caffeine, which is an addictive substance, it's unethical to withdraw it and reintroduce it. Another limitation is the self-reporting. Some other contributors could result in the consequences felt after caffeine consumption, such as stress, medical issues, medications, hormonal changes. As mentioned in the original study, the original participant was going through menopause, which could have resulted in the fatigue and headaches. For this study to be more valid, we would need objective measurements. So the self-reporting and diary log, would it be sufficient enough? We would need to do blood tests, urine tests, and other tests of that nature. Some limitations that we had thought of our replication would be the length of time. It was a short amount of time to reduce caffeine to truly see benefits. The intervention phase was roughly 9 days, and I think that you would need several weeks or at least a month of intervention to see a difference or feel a difference benefit-wise. And again, there could be other contributing factors to the consequences felt from not consuming caffeine. And so now I will share, as mentioned before, we did interview questions, and I created a couple visuals in conclusion to our project. The first question was, will you continue limiting caffeine intake? 60% of our participants said yes, while 40% said no. And then, did you find the replacement behavior of drinking water decaffeinated tea/coffee to be sufficient? 100% said no, which isn't surprising since caffeine is an addictive substance, and water in decaffeinated tea and coffee wouldn't give you the same effect that caffeine does. So thank you for watching, and this concludes our presentation.